Hey, what's going on, everybody? On today's Locked On Badgers, we're going to take a bit of a controversial stance. Badger fans should be thankful beyond measure for the time Gary Andersen spent with the program, why he's so underrated, and why his impact at Wisconsin is still being felt on today's Locked On Badgers.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Locked On Badgers. Thank you for making this your first listen every day you are able. I am Ryan Herrings, your host of Locked On Badgers. Really appreciate everybody tuning in. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Guys, I teased it off the jump. This is going to be a bit of a controversial episode, maybe. I think it's something that I would like to talk about. Occasionally it's good to go into the Wayback Machine and just have some fun with some topics. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. Listen, Badger fans straight up should be much more thankful of Gary Andersen and the time he spent with Wisconsin, which sounds crazy, right? Because if you go to a bar and you saddle up next to a Badgers fan, like a diehard Badgers fan, and you bring up the word Gary Andersen, he's going to say 59-0 Ohio State. I hate that man, right? Because that's the last image we have of Gary Andersen, losing in the Big Ten title game 59-0 against Ohio State, losing as a favorite, and then basically turning tail and running. I'm going to flip it on its head. I'm going to tell you why Badger fans should be incredibly grateful that Gary Andersen was the coach here and why. Let's start here. I think the most obvious, the biggest one. Listen, Gary Andersen, for all of his flaws, and listen, we're going to get to some of that as well. He wasn't perfect, obviously wasn't perfect by any stretch. For all of his flaws, the guy built the defensive culture at Wisconsin. The current defensive culture, hear me out here, was built by Gary Andersen by way of Dave Aranda. Okay? If you remember the Brett Bielema defenses at Wisconsin, the 4-3 defenses, not really aggressive, kind of a bend but don't break. Occasionally you had like Brian Schofield, something like that coming off the edge, but it was really a kind of conservative, bend but don't break defense. Nothing special, right? And then what happens as soon as Gary Andersen gets to Madison? I want everyone to think back. What happens? He brings this dude named Dave Aranda with him. Okay. What does Dave Aranda do? Dave Aranda takes Wisconsin's conservative Iowa Northwestern-y style defense, that 4-3, and he flips it. He said, we're going to play an aggressive 3-4. We're going to send pressure from different spots. We're going to turn our linebackers into playmakers. We're going to put our corners on an island and have a little trust that they're going to hold up and occasionally get burned, but mostly hold up. And what happened? Wisconsin over the last decade has been, listen, you could argue statistically, and this would not be true from a pure NFL talent standpoint, but you could argue statistically, Wisconsin's defense has been the best, second or third best defense, maybe behind Alabama, Georgia, in the country in the last decade, right? Since Gary Andersen got to Wisconsin, since he got to Madison in 2013, in scoring defense, Wisconsin has ranked 6th, 17th, 1st, 4th, 3rd, 34th, 10th, 9th, and 4th in scoring defense. So 7 of the 9 years, it's been a top 10 scoring defense, including a 4, a 1, a 3, a 4. They've been incredible. Like, they've been the absolute engine of Wisconsin football for the last 8, 9, 10 years. And this all started with Gary Andersen. We have to give credit where credit is due. He came to Wisconsin from Utah State. He was a defensive guy, and he saw one of the great rising stars in college football in Dave Aranda, and he said, I'm going to turn the defense over to you. You're going to run the defense at Wisconsin. And to his credit, he gave him the ability to do what Dave Aranda wanted to do, which was to be aggressive, to run a 3-4, to play press, to get pressure, to turn linebackers into wrecking balls. And you look at what's happened in the last 9 years. What's happened? Wisconsin now recruits linebackers like they recruit offensive tackles, right? We're in on Tackett Curtis this year, a borderline 5-star linebacker from Louisiana, right? That kind of thing would never have happened under Bielema or Christ, even. If Christ had never, been given Dave Aranda that defense, I don't think any of that would have happened. This is all going back. If you trace that line chart, if you plot it out, it goes directly back to Gary Andersen. And really, what's the hallmark of Paul Christ's Badger teams? The hallmark is great defense and a good running game. A borderline great running game. Let's give credit where credit's due. I'm not trying to shortchange anything else. But the hallmark really has been a great defense with incredible linebackers. That's Gary Andersen's fingerprints all over it. The echoes of Gary Andersen past continue to push this program forward. And it's wild the amount of, I get it. There's a lot of criticism towards Gary Andersen for a lot of valid things, right? There's criticism for the way in-state coaches started to drift away from him, feel like that connection wasn't there. That's been validated in several spots by several people. That's a real thing. There's criticism by the way it ended. That's obviously a real thing. Criticism for the way he handled his quarterbacks. Obviously a real thing. But this team and this program really has been successful over the last decade-ish, 9 years-ish, because of the defense. And that's because, again, if you're going to trace that back to an origin point, the big bang of this defense, of the defense was Gary Andersen getting to Madison. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's been a game changer for Wisconsin. It's one of the few reasons that they've been able to compete at the level they've been able to compete at without the quarterback play. They just haven't had the quarterback play, which again is weirdly, that's an area Paul Christ was supposed to come in and fix, and it hasn't happened. So people, I give Paul Christ a lot of credit for coming in and not fixing what wasn't broken. A lot of coaches come in, or a lot of managers come in any profession, right? Forget just sports. A lot of people come in and they want to clean house. They want to change everything. They're control freaks. Paul Christ came in and, it probably wasn't that hard to see Dave Aranda as a genius. But at least Paul Christ came in. He maintained it. He kept Aranda. He kept the defense. And let's give credit where credit's due. But again, that all started with Gary Andersen. And when we look at where we're at now, we look at the Nick Herbigs, right? We look at TJ Watt playing outside linebacker. We look at the inside linebackers we've had, the big nose tackles, the Keanu Bentons, the Olive Sagapolos, the defense that has been built here, the attacking, aggressive, never-ending stream of linebackers to the NFL. Like Wisconsin over the last 9 years has put as many linebackers in the NFL as any college program. What they've done is incredible. I was listening to an NFL scout a year or two ago talk about, I think it was Van Ginkel, and he was saying this is just another in a never-ending line of Wisconsin linebackers headed to the NFL. And those are words you never thought you'd hear, a never-ending line of linebackers heading to the NFL from Wisconsin. All of that traces its DNA back to Gary Andersen. So that number one is why people, when you look back at that Gary Andersen era, understand the foibles, understand the problems, understand the issues, but also understand what he built into this program to help it sustain success. It's a really interesting thing because his era was so weird. Came in, won a lot, established a great defense, but also had tons of issues and left like in a blink of an eye with the worst loss ever. And I think because of that, again, people lose sight of what he helped to build here. But his fingerprints are still all over this defense. The way it's ran and kind of the lineage of Aranda to Wilcox to Leonard. Yeah, it's pretty impressive what they have going on that side of the ball. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit more about Gary Andersen. Why, once again, his era and his coaching tenure, the 3 years he spent here, weren't as bad as people think, and definitely not as bad as people remember. The 2 years he spent here, I'm sorry, as bad as people remember. But first, today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline remains your number one source, all your sports betting needs and information. A great spot for online Vegas games, roulette, blackjack, all sorts of stuff you can do. The website's easy to use. It's a great time for futures. We talked a bunch about Wisconsin being over under 8.5 in wins. You're going to be able to put on futures, Heisman bets, NFL, baseball's going on. The draft is some future wagers here. So it's a great time. Do it responsibly, but it's a great way to enjoy sports in a different method. Test your knowledge. If you have a great early feel for the NBA next year, you can get great value on BetOnline right now if you have an in on somebody like, I don't know, for example, the Memphis Grizzlies, a team that's only going to get better with age. It's a great time, great moment to go on BetOnline, have a little fun, do it responsibly, of course. But yeah, it's something that's a lot of fun, really enjoyable. We do it at Locked On. Head to the website today. Use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and actions. BetOnline, where the game starts. Guys, thank you again for making Locked On Badgers your first listen every single day. Really appreciate it. Can't tell you how much it means to me. It's something that it's humbling to have people listen, and I will never take that for granted, I promise. So for everyone that does that, I really, really appreciate it. NBA draft coming up. So the NBA Draft channel is going to do live on NBA Draft tonight. So if you have a favorite NBA team, make sure you subscribe now to their Locked On YouTube channel so you can get notified when they go live on draft night. So you can see instant reaction from tons of different insiders, your local Locked On show. It's going to be a great time. Draft is coming up. Obviously, Johnny Davis is in on that as well. Let's continue this conversation with Gary Andersen, everybody. The other thing that I think people forget about with Gary Andersen, right? And it's easy to do because, again, I understand how it ended. It's like a great, I won't even say great, but like a good movie trilogy that ends with a terrible movie. Like you kind of forget the first couple chapters. Gary Andersen also just straight up won. Like when you look back at his tenure and you talk to Badger fans, you kind of feel like he was a 500 coach. He won 81% of his conference games. Again, short sample size. I get it. This is not a show to advocate putting Gary Andersen in the College Football Hall of Fame or to put him up on the Camp Randall facade. Nothing like that. I just want to give people a different perspective looking back at Gary Andersen in his time here. The guy won 81% of his conference games. He was 13-3 in conference. For comparison, Paul Chryst, who's done a really good job at Wisconsin, has won 72% of his conference games. I mean, bigger sample size. I think if Gary Andersen had stayed here, that number would have gone down. But again, like he won while he was here. 19-7 overall, 81% conference games. And a guy that in his 2 years here, he did win a Big Ten West title, beat Minnesota every time. It's a winning tenure. He built the defense. And the other thing I'd say that I think is really important, and I do think people understand this and have talked about it, but he also gave Paul Chryst time to develop as a head coach, right? Like this was the way this all worked and the way this was all timed out almost felt like somehow Barry Alvarez was playing 3D chess, right? Paul Chryst had left the year before to go to Pitt, first-time head coach. The Wisconsin job opened up and they didn't. Paul Chryst probably would have came back to Wisconsin if Barry had asked him. But since he had just taken the Pitt job, Barry had vouched for him. They didn't want to burn Pitt. So he hired Gary Andersen instead. What this allowed, it allowed Paul Chryst to kind of grow on the job, to get 3 years of real, incredibly valuable OJT on-the-job training at Pitt, at being the head coach for 3 years. And it wasn't a great Pitt tenure, but he took over a really tough spot. That Pitt program had gone through a couple head coaches. It was kind of a dumpster fire. Chryst was able to go in there and kind of stabilize it, do the best he could do, get it back on at least stable footing. And in doing so, I think he grew as a coach. While Gary Andersen was running Wisconsin, was winning, was building this defense, was also having a disaster of time at quarterback. And again, Gary Andersen's not perfect here. That's not the story I'm trying to paint. But while Gary Andersen was running Wisconsin, Paul Chryst was gaining experience at Pitt. He was learning on the job. He was learning how to build a staff, learning how to recruit as a head coach, right? Learning how to be that head coach in charge, that guy that he had never been before. So then when Gary Andersen loops around and it's time where he leaves, right? And if he hadn't left, Barry Alvarez has said, and I don't know how true this is. I have different theories in my head. Barry Alvarez has basically said, if he wasn't going to leave, I was probably going to get rid of him at some point. He's intimidated that, right? He's kind of talked around that, saying that the fit wasn't great and I wasn't heartbroken when he left. Now, some of that might just be Barry Alvarez being a little bitter. Some of it might be true. I don't really know. But either way, on one side, you had Paul Chryst gaining experience while Gary Andersen was running the ship and I'm not sinking it, right? So then when Gary Andersen left, you were able to bring Paul Chryst in. He has 3 years of experience. He's not fresh on the job. He's coming in with a little more understanding of how to build a staff, how to put together the program. And I think it's just all worked perfectly. I don't think you could have asked for, again, it wasn't intentional. It definitely wasn't intentional, but it was almost like you hired a temp to give Paul Chryst experience to come back in. And the temp also, by the way, did a really good job and did some lasting things that impacted the program. So when I look back at it, again, it almost feels like, if you didn't know better, Barry Alvarez was playing kind of 3D chess here. I'm going to get this guy for a couple of years. We're going to give Paul Chryst experience. This guy's going to build a defense, and then Paul's going to be able to come back in with his experience, take over the program. I'm going to have the guy I want, but he's not going to learn on the job. It's just interesting how it worked. I think people kind of forget forget how much Gary Andersen won when he was here, just from a statistical standpoint. They forget that the defense that has really elevated this program and pushed it forward was a Gary Andersen thing. He's kind of the architect of that. And that's really important. Paul Chryst gets credit for not tearing that down, for continuing that and continue to build on it, by the way. He's the guy that hired Wilcox. He's the guy that promoted Jim Leonard. So Paul Chryst deserves credit here as well. None of this is to say Paul Chryst hasn't had any hand in this, but he kind of took over the ship that was already sailing on his course defensively. And quite frankly, Paul Chryst was brought in because of his familiarity with the program, but also because he's an offensive guy. And that offense has really been what's fallen a little short. So it's interesting that the defense has continued to propel this program, which was really more of a Gary Andersen legacy. It's just interesting to me looking back at the time, how it helped Paul Chryst prepare, how it helped the Wisconsin defense become this just absolute force that's now kind of become a self-actuating machine. I'm not sure exactly what I'm saying, but basically we're to the point now with Wisconsin's defense where it recruits itself. So it's kind of a reloading machine that you just have to not break, right? You don't have to tweak it much anymore. You just keep feeding in these linebackers that now Wisconsin recruits easier and easier because the success is more and more there. And I think that defense is set up to continue to be successful. Again, all going back to that Gary Andersen hire. Coming up, guys, we have a little bit more Gary Andersen talk. I know this show's a little off topic with everything we've been doing, but I thought it'd be a fun discussion. I'm curious what you guys think of it. If you think I'm way off base, if Gary Andersen was a complete disaster, I get it. Coming up on the next segment, we're going to talk about some of the most memorable moments from the Gary Andersen era, which includes some big clunkers. Like, we all know those. So today's show is brought to you by the following sponsors, and join us after the break. We can chop up some of the biggest and worst moments of the Gary Andersen era. And where's he at now? What happened to him? All right, guys, thank you again for making Locked On Badgers your first listen every single day. I appreciate it so much. Can't tell you how much I appreciate it. If you like the show, obviously, please leave, if you can, if you have a moment, subscribe, leave a like, leave a review, join the Discord where we're starting to get some conversations going. We're going to do some giveaways on the Discord. So we're going to just continue to try to build the community, which I'm really excited about. And let's continue this off the beaten track, kind of random, but to me, really fun Gary Andersen discussion. So a couple of the biggest moments from Gary Andersen's tenure, or the things I remember the most, there was the Arizona State game. I don't know if people remember the Arizona State game. It was out in Tempe. It was an early non-conference game, and Wisconsin was trailing towards the end of it. Wisconsin and Joel Stave, they were driving down. They were setting themselves up actually in really good position to kick a game-winning field goal. Would have been, I think, like a 33-yarder. Joel Stave goes to kneel, right? Goes to spike the ball, sorry. And the refs ruled a fumble. An Arizona State player fell on it. It was just a complete disaster. It was a Pac-12 refereeing crew. It was one of the worst jobs ever. The clock should have stopped. Wisconsin should have been able to kick a field goal. Instead, it runs out with an Arizona State player, defensive lineman, kind of falling on top of it. The refs run out of the stadium knowing that they just jobbed the Badgers. Gary Andersen was asked after the game, how long does something like this stick with you? And I think he said, something like this never goes away. It's always going to be frustrating. And I agree. I look back at it and I was so annoyed, and I'm still like it. It's not a big deal. It ended up, obviously, that team wasn't playing for a natty or anything like that. But it was just one of the most annoying, painful losses in a long time. And I'll never forget that one. I'd also stayed up all night because it was a late game. And I got back from a hike, and it just, to see that at like 2 a.m. Eastern when it wrapped up was just nauseating. The other big moment is obviously the 59-0 that horrible Ohio State loss, where Wisconsin actually went into the Big Ten title game that year as a 3-point favorite over Ohio State, right? And then Cardell Jones came out, the backup to the backup, and just started raining terror from the skies on the Wisconsin secondary. Melvin Gordon had a bad game, but quite frankly, everybody had a bad game. That Ohio State team was playing for a playoff berth, right? They had to essentially demolish Wisconsin again, and that's what they did. I watched the entire game. I don't know how you guys are on blowouts. I watch every minute of every game because I really like it when Wisconsin blows people out. So I feel like I have to. I don't know why. I feel like if Wisconsin's game blowing out, if I'm watching all the blowouts, I have to watch it on both ends. So I watched the entire game. At the end, I was just rooting for a score, some type of like, please don't shut us out. And it never came. And then, pretty quickly after, Gary Andersen left it was just such a bizarre, weird ending to a pretty successful coaching tenure from a win-loss standpoint. I don't know if we've seen really the equivalent of that at a Big Ten school where someone comes in, they win 80% of their conference games, they get smashed in a conference title game, and then they just leave, right, for a much lesser Pac-12 school. It was really bizarre, really strange. And then he went to Oregon State, lasted 3 years, got fired, went back to Utah State, lasted 2 years, got fired, and that was it. It's a really weird coaching arc, right? From a guy who brought Utah State to 11 wins, took over a big-time job at Wisconsin, won 81% of his conference games, left on his own accord, and then within 5 or 6 years was out of coaching after 2 failed stops. It's very bizarre, very weird. The last thing I would say with Gary Andersen, and I think this is important sometimes, timing's everything, right? Time's everything in life, and I think Gary Andersen was here at the right time for the right amount of time, and we can appreciate that. That doesn't mean that he was the right fit long-term, right? But I think he was here for the right time at the right amount of time. And for me, it was like I joined the military out of high school because I was a total mess in high school. And the military, I wasn't a great fit for the military for 20 years because I didn't want to do it. But for 9 years, I did 9 years in the Navy, and it was incredible for me. It was win-win. I did really well, honorable discharge, and I used the Navy to really propel myself into some other areas. And I kind of liken that to Gary Andersen. Like, Gary Andersen wasn't a long-term fit at Wisconsin. If he had stayed for a longer time, I don't think it would have worked out as well. But it was a great fit for when he was there and what Wisconsin needed, what Paul Chryst needed, and kind of frankly what he needed. And the Wisconsin program is better for it. So that's where I'm at with Gary Andersen, guys. I don't know if anyone's listening, if maybe no one has any interest in this topic whatsoever, and it's only me, but the Gary Andersen era was pretty successful, actually, for Wisconsin when you look at what he did and the lasting impacts of it and where Wisconsin is now in some ways because of it. So, yeah, if you like the show, guys, again, I know this one is a little off topic, but it's something that I've always kind of enjoyed looking back at and kind of thinking how well it worked out in a weird way. So if you like the show, please leave a like, review, subscription. Send me an email if you want to talk about something on the show. Join the Discord. We have a channel set up on the Discord for podcast questions. You can ask, throw some questions in there for future guests. I'm going to put all of my future guests in the Discord, so you can look that up and submit questions. We have Gus Yalden coming up on the show, a couple other guys coming up on the show. So those will all go in there. And that's about it, guys. Really appreciate it. We're going to continue having great conversation this week. Summer's here, but the conversation and the content's going to keep coming. Really appreciate everyone for listening. Thank you for making Locked On Badgers your first listen every single day.